We're not talking about bonds or stocks or even diamonds. We're talking about the masterpieces of artistic achievement.
In this episode, I'm talking to Steve Kurkjian, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist. Steve worked on the Boston Globe Spotlight team to help expose the widespread sexual abuse and cover-up by Boston's Catholic Archdiocese. Steve is also the author of Master Thieves, the Boston gangsters who pulled off the world's greatest art heist. Steve talks about growing up in Dorchester, writing for the Globe, and his unfinished hunt for the stolen Gardner paintings. You're listening to the Old Dirty Boston podcast. Steve is the author of Master Thieves, the Boston gangsters who pulled off the world's greatest art heist. I have looked into some of the research when I did the initial podcast on the Gardner heist. I really have to give you a lot of credit because you had done so much work on it. You had looked under every rock, turned over every stone. And I'm really curious how you got started on the Gardner to begin with. Was it something through the Globe or a personal thing?
Yes. Yeah, I was in Washington when the theft took place as the Globe's bureau chief in Washington. But by a year or two later, I came back to Boston, situated myself in the newsroom, was doing investigative reporting from the newsroom, and thought after a year or two or three that the story needed a update. Had a reporter who was working for me, Dan Golden at the time. He did a very good update as to where the case was. Now this was 3 or 4 years later. So that got laid down until 1997. And in fact, I think it's just around my birthday in late August of 97, the Herald came out with a page 1 story. We've seen it. Headline: We 'VE seen it, with a photograph of the stolen Rembrandt Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was an incredible scoop, and in the Globe had a reporter or two chasing it, and one of the editors, a city editor at the time, Sean Murphy, who was still doing consumer reporting at the Globe, he came to my office and he in the newsroom, he said, "Steve, can you help us out here? You know, we need somebody who's got some sources, or is good at investigative work, who can get on the story for us." And I said, "Of course, I'd love to do it. And it's the other city editor, so let's do it." So I got on it. That remained a mystery in my mind. In my book, 20 years later, which came out almost 20 years later, in 2015, I have a full interview with the reporter on that story and what he found or what he saw. The reporter's name was Tom Mashberg, very credible reporter, had some pretty good sources at the museum, and but he had stated in his article that he had seen for a very brief time. It was in a very darkened warehouse room. Had been taken to by a source of his, turned out to be a guy named William Youngworth, and shown what Youngworth attested to be the Storm of the Sea of Galilee. But he was shown it so quickly, is a possibility that maybe, and Tom acknowledges in the article, it may have been a replica. But it seemed to me to be, always has seemed to me to be a distant possibility, because Tom and Matt and Youngworth had only been working together. He had been using Youngworth in stories about the theft or about the attempts for recovery for less than a month, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And I just didn't think someone could paint. If you were going to scam Mashberg to write that headline, to write that story, and in fact trick him into writing a story like that, how could you paint a masterpiece so good that it would trick a reporter, a good reporter like Tom Mashberg? Well, that bothered me, and Tom later said that he thinks he was tricked. I still don't know how he was tricked, but the reason why Tom says he was tricked was not because of what he saw, but more important, by how he was shown it. As he described the event in the warehouse, the Youngworth not identify the gentleman, but just his source, took the canvas out of a receptacle, held it above his head, and then, quote, unfurled it, quote unquote. And he, in working with the museum, particularly its security director, Anthony Mori, determined there's no way, with the lacquer and the little lacquer that had been applied to that 17th century painting over the years to preserve it, there's no way you could have unfurled it. No way you could have rolled it up or unrolled it. It was just too stiff a painting. So Tom attested in later stories that he didn't see it, but I was so fascinated by how he had gotten to see it, and let's say still that Youngworth had tricked him, how Youngworth had put together such a masterpiece that was able to trick a good reporter like that. So
and weren't
that's
paint
the
chips tested?
too long of a story about how I got onto it. And then as I worked it, and I sort of, when you're in the newsroom on a story that isn't providing instant solution, arrest not being made, or a bill not being passed, an election not taking place, then you are responsible for it. So I did that for the next 10 years, and would do what we call anniversary stories about the theft and where is it, and when one bad guy or another would reach out to the museum or the FBI and then make his or her presence known, that they were trying to negotiate to get the paintings brought back, you'd write a story or two about it. You'd follow as I say, the bouncing ball, and write about it. So by 2007, when I retired, I felt that there's a book here. Is a good book here. In 2004, I had gotten the cooperation of the museum, which was, was being very, very quiet in providing any information about leads they had gotten or how the theft had taken place. They were good enough to share some of that information with me, which I think sort of sparked coverage of the story. That by that time was 15 years after the theft, 2005, and that was a very big, important story about who the night watchmen were, who were, and why, what had happened in the theft itself. We knew very little about the step-by-step 81 minutes inside the museum that the thieves had taken in carrying off their heist, and that story broke it down. So that's how I got into it, and why I continue to stay fascinated by it. I just think it's just as I wanted the subtitle to be, Boston's last best secret.
Yeah,
and we're a city that's we've got known out there for secrets. That Whitey Bulger had a secret alliance with the FBI. That was a part of the secret, that the archdiocese was holding on to the secret, that they were condoning, if not encouraging, abuse by its priests by not reporting them to the police when they found out priests had done some bad. Those were terrific secrets, and they had been broken and made known by the Globe Spotlight team. And I, having a history of being a founding member of the Spotlight team, I thought this deserves to have full coverage, intense, full coverage.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty proud of what the Globe continues to do on it, what I did on it, and the attention we're bringing to the case.
Well, Boston is a tight-lipped town, that's for sure.
Well, it used to be. It used to be in old dirty Boston, we'll tell you. The code was omerta, and I grew up in that city. I'm a boy, very proud of my ethnic and upbringing as an Armenian, and also my growing up in a lower middle class neighborhood. That you knew each other on the streets, but you didn't ever spread secrets about another family.
Yeah. What part of Boston did you grow up in?
It was in Codman Square in Dorchester.
Okay.
And I went to all the Boston public schools, Boston Latin School. And as I said at a talk that I gave at Latin School several years ago, Latin School was the only place that I knew in old tribal Boston. By tribal, you did not wander away from your neighborhood, and you stayed true to your ethnicity. And I was very proud and Armenian, and I had a good big family of Armenians both in and around Dorchester, and I was very proud of that. But that's how people knew me.
Well, I knew there were a lot of Armenian families in Watertown. Yeah,
very much so. But my family, my cousins, uncles had owned a grocery store on Talbot Ave, and when I had nothing to do, when I wasn't in the library, my nose in the books, I was at their grocery store, passing the time of day with my cousins and my uncles.
Yeah.
So, and that's how I got to know people. But you didn't wander away. But the one place that was different was Latin School. And I entered there 11 or 12 years old, 7th grade, and that was different. It was the one place that everyone got treated the same. It didn't matter if you came from Codman Square or Charlestown. It didn't matter if you came from, the upper wards in West Roxbury, and your father owned a business, and you got driven to school, or you like me, you took the rambling old buses to Talbot Ave bus to Dudley, and you took a big tank that rumbled its way to Louis Pasteur Avenue at Latin School. It didn't matter. You all got treated miserably. So it was a great equalizer. And also, you got exposed to the city. You got to know. I got to know, for the first time, Latvian and Lithuanian kids. There were no Latvian and Lithuanian kids on Wheatland and Millet. And I got to learn about soccer in the 50s. That was as strange as a Swedish pastry. You just didn't get exposed to it. But when you got exposed, it's just like you. They're struggling. They're hard at work. They're working on weekends. And so going to work for the Globe just upheld that high.
Oh yeah, I mean it's
my high motivation.
The high standard of Boston. It really is something that's sort of been part of the community, and it's just had the voice of, it holds so much weight and gravity, the Boston Globe.
Yeah.
So when you got there, what year was it? When did you start?
Started in '68.
Society was changing so quickly then. Vietnam was going on.
Right.
It
really
sex
was.
and rock and roll.
One of my assignments was part of the coverage of the Vietnam protests. But I had already worked at the State House for a year or two, not for the Globe, but a small news service called the State House News Service, which still thrives, and learned how to, ask a question. I had not majored in journalism. I had not at Boston University. I had majored in English, but I loved to write, and I wasn't too successful a creative writer. But my mother was a librarian at the Boston Herald, and the men and women whom I met through her, reporters, they loved to write as much as I did, and they had found a way of making a living, and that's through journalism. So I started I worked for the Boston University newspaper and in sports, and my mother said, "You're not going to make enough money to raise a family, but you can do that while you go to law school." So I a good Armenian boy, I did what my mother told me to do. So I went to law school nights, and I worked up at the State House. And when I joined the Globe 2 years into my law school career, it was a 4-year program. They were pleased. They were glad that I was getting extra education. So I graduated in 1970, fully believing that I was going to become a lawyer. But then the summer of '69 happened. August of '69, they told me, "You have to take a week off." And I said, I don't want to take a week because I'm going to have to go back to school in September, and I'll have no fun. The best fun any young man or young woman could have in Boston at the time was working at the Globe. Yeah, so I said, no, I don't want to take it. I'll stay here. Don't worry. And they said, no, you have to take it off. And I saw that there was a music festival. I'm a big rock and roll fan still. And there was a music festival going on in upstate New York. And I said to the kid beside me, he was an intern, and I said to him, I said, Mark, you look at this. We drove out there, and what was supposed to be 80,000 people was then 400,000, and so I started covering it for the Globe. So being able to say 50 years later that you covered Woodstock, even my grandkids get a chuckle out of it.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, that changed my life, and I said, I'll get my law degree, which I didn't pass the bar, but I was never going to do anything else. But
was the Gardner heist, do you think, the most exciting story?
Perplexing is not. I think as far as world of difference, and I don't know anybody who can ever say that you'd worked on a bigger story than the clergy abuse scandal. I mean, that is earth-shattering. To think an institution would be allowing abuse, tolerating abuse, maybe even condoning abuse of the most vulnerable among us, kids, by its brethren. It's just it continues to shock me, and I still don't know why it was allowed. They said that there was a conference in '85, and the cardinals, including Cardinal Law, realized that the thing was out of control. But they also realized that if they reported every one of them, to the police, which they should have done hundreds of years ago, anytime it would have stopped. But instead they tolerated it. They sent them off to some counseling for a crime that that you should be prosecuted first before you get any counseling.
Yeah.
That it went like wildfire, that abuse. And you knew, if you were a priest, that if you were vulnerable or to that kind of illness, this pedophilia, that you could find some safe haven within the clergy, within the Catholic Church. It's ridiculous when you think of that. That's what some of them. That was within the families. That's what was known. You could do that.
Okay, so with the Gardner story, you start working on it. Are you instantly enthralled? Because, I mean, you went on, a 10-plus year run of kind of researching this, looking into it. And to me, there's so many levels of excitement. One, to crack what really is the biggest mystery, as you said, in Boston. There's a $10 million reward.
Yep.
And there's also just kind of figuring out the puzzle that no one else could crack.
Yeah. Well, all at the time when I was at the Globe, until I got the assistance of the museum to a degree, not everything, but we were working with crackpots, screwballs, for the most part. The FBI does not share information, and did not until 2013 say a word about it.
Do you think,
except for a statement that they were working diligently on the case, and thank you for any leads you might provide. And then every year or so, on every anniversary of March 18th, 1990, the FBI and the museum, separately or together, would release a statement saying that, our hearts are broken and our masterpiece remain missing, and we remain committed to getting them back. And I would write dutifully about them. But the crackpots and the screwballs were those people who were in jail, or fraudsters who said that they could provide a lead to their recovery.
Right.
Unnamed people whom each of them was familiar with, had confessed or they knew was involved in the case, but if they could just get $10,000 or whatever it was, they would provide the information. And they would just smart enough, and they'd hire a lawyer or two who would give you a hint of information. And it doesn't take much to get this wildfire, or this tinder up in flames again, because it is such a terrific story, and it's such. We're not talking about bonds or stocks or even diamonds. We're talking about the masterpieces of artistic achievement.
Right.
As one of the lawyers said to his client on his deathbed, 1,000 years from now, there'll be guys like you, criminals, and there'll be guys like me defending guys like you. But in all those years, there'll only still be one Rembrandt. And only one Rembrandt, and Rembrandt, did only one seascape.
Right.
And that was stolen from the Gardner Museum.
Do you think that bringing in the FBI so quickly closed off a lot of opportunity? Because in reality, the underworld was where kind of the truth lie and where the people actually may have known something. And there was no chance in hell that they would ever speak to an FBI agent and give them anything.
Well, we think that. We think that. I mean, that's the modern thought. But people in jail are alone, and my sense is, while they and their attorneys attest that they would never talk to an FBI agent, I think if they had information that could lead to the recovery and would not jeopardize someone else's score, which means that someone whom they directly knew, as long as no one was going to get hurt by their information, I think these people would die to give up the information. Thankfully, you and I have never spent any time in jail. It is long, hard days and nights. If they had any idea, people had any idea where these masterpieces could have been hidden, I think that they have now an obligation, have a purpose to pick up the phone and give that information to the authorities. Give it to the museum. The museum has an investigator working on it, around the clock. The FBI has an agent working on it around the clock, and I'll give it to a newspaper, give it to a reporter like myself. We're not around the clock, but we're still working on it.
And do you think that those people are alive that would have information?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
So where they hid it is not known. It still isn't known. And the FBI has done any number of house searches and garages, and even at Suffolk Downs. They did a search of Suffolk Downs in 2015 to see they had gotten a tip on it. They will go to the nth degree to get it. But my sense is investigation has not done the trick. Every suspect has been looked at diligently, and it still hasn't gained a recovery. So I say go at it in another direction, and that is to appeal to Boston's, in every neighborhood's conscience, and say to people with a social media campaign, same kind of social media campaign that Pete Frates, now the late Pete Frates, was involved with, to raise millions upon millions of dollars for ALS research. A similar campaign as that. Put in front of those empty frames the two Rembrandts. That museum was opened in 1903. And Isabella Stewart Gardner was the wife of a very successful, well-to-do Massachusetts businessman, John Jack Gardner. And she had fallen in love, both of them had fallen in love with buying artwork in their world travels. After he passed away, she decided she would open a museum, but not just for the legacy of the family name. What she had seen in the world travels that she had been on was that the civilizations that survived, even though there was no country there anymore, but there was a civilization. Those civilizations were those civilizations that had produced art, that had been inspired by art, whether it was sculptures, paintings, and that's why she opened that museum, because she realized America in the start of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, America was becoming a world power. With the Industrial Revolution had taken off, and America was driving it, and it was becoming, both militarily and economically a world power. But it did not have an appreciation of art. And she wanted to inspire an American tradition of art. So that's why she put those on the wall. She put it for us. And as I complete this circle, like I like to say, Michelangelo, he did not come from the upper crust. Artists do not come from those high schools or colleges that train us. It can happen because God has blessed you. And it could be from any level of society. No matter how rich or how poor your family is, you can be the greatest artist ever. And that's why she had those pieces on the wall to inspire us. And did it work? It did. How do I know it? Because my father is proof of it. My father was a survivor of the Armenian genocide, came to this country with his mother. His father was killed in the eastern province of Turkey, and he came here as a young boy in the early 20s, and he lived in Watertown, and he went to Watertown High School, and there they saw he had an artistic ability, and they got him a scholarship to a school at the time, an art school at the time in the South End, Vespa George. And he later told me, he said every day after his classes, he would walk over to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Wow.
Because it was free of charge. In order to generate enthusiasm among the public, she insisted when she opened it in 1903, no charge.
Wow.
You get in free.
Well, again, I can't stress enough how important I think it is for someone to read Master Thieves, your book. Again, it's Steve Kurkjian, to get the full story. But I also think that naming the names is really important because you never know. It could be someone's niece. It could be someone's grandson, granddaughter. They hear that name and something clicks. And, you know, even with that call-in that we had, that was just, he never even put together the Gardner heist. But he said, wait a minute, this sounds similar to that story. Is there something there? So I believe that a lot of people that could help find it really don't know that they could be connected to it. They don't know it could be in their grandfather's house.
It's true. You go amongst people, and especially leave Boston proper. Go to other states and say, have you ever heard of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? And maybe they've heard of it.
Well, even the museum does not, they don't want it in any of their publicity because it's a bit of a...
it's embarrassing.
It is, yeah. And they were advised by the MFA to increase their security or given the offer of we'll help you, and they rejected it.
Reject is too strong a word. They didn't act on it quickly enough. And they were putting in technology that has helped them in the end in trying to figure out what happened when during that night of March 18th, early morning hours. But what they didn't do, hadn't gotten around to, is improving the quality of their security. They weren't paying enough money to their security staff, and as a result, it was not to be dismissive, but anybody who would be working for very low level, I think it's just above minimum wage of $3.75, whatever then, an hour. So you got in people who weren't that dedicated to paying attention.
Again, I was told by someone that he thought that they were on a farm, and who knows? There are so many opinions, there's so many little dips and drabs, but again, I would amplify what you're saying, which is just that if you know anything, if you were related to anyone that ever had a whisper or a suspicion of these paintings in this robbery, that you really should reach out and talk to us. You can send an email or a message. Yeah.
Call the museum, call the authorities.
We'll call Steve or call myself, only because I think it's intimidating for people to call the museum. It's intimidating for people to call. They don't know what they're getting into. And I would just say, speak to someone. And if you feel unconfident about doing it yourself, you do owe it to everybody to just speak up and let it be known that there could be a little piece of information, and you never know what that could unlock with everything else that's out there.
Now, you get your artwork back, you don't get prosecuted, and there's a $10 million reward. That's pretty good incentive.
Yeah.
For me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Steve. Again, your book, Master Thieves, The Boston Gangsters Who Pulled Off the World's Greatest Art Heist, is an incredible read. I would encourage anyone out there to get it, and they can get it on Amazon. And honestly, the book, really goes into detail. It's an incredible story. And last question: would you or have you spoken about ever having this converted to a screenplay or put on the big screen?
Yeah, I did have my book optioned to a very good studio, TriStar. and I was hopeful, but it did not go to production. So it remains out there, a unproduced but still gripping story.
So they can make Black Mass, but they can't make the story of the greatest art heist in history.
We don't have our last chapter yet.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, Steve. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.
This is the Old Dirty Boston Podcast.